Cutter's Creek, Montana Territory. November 1887. The cold arrived like an invading army that month. It did not warn anyone. It did not send scouts. It simply came down from the Canadian Rockies in a single night and turned the entire Gallatin Valley into something that no longer resembled a place where people were supposed to live. By the third week of November, 14 families in the Cutter's Creek settlement had burned through half their winter wood. 2 horses died in the alderman pasture. The creek froze solid in 38 hours. At the northern edge of the valley, where the hillside curved down toward a stand of dead cottonwoods, something different was happening. From the road it looked wrong. It looked like a mistake. A low mound of earth and stone barely visible above the snow line, with a dark crooked entrance cut into the hillside and a short stubby chimney rising only 4 feet above the grade. Neighbors who rode past slowed their horses and shook their heads. It did not look like a home. It looked like the beginning of something that had been abandoned. But inside, something no one expected was taking shape. Her name was Clara Mae Hutchins. She was 34 years old. She had dark circles under her eyes that had been there since April, and she moved through her days like a woman who had decided that stopping was no longer an option. They stopped believing she would fail on December 3, 1887. But that is getting ahead of the story. Thomas Hutchins had been dead since April 14th of that same year. He was 37. He went down at the Yellowstone River crossing on a supply run, the wagon wheel catching a submerged boulder, the current doing the rest. His body was recovered 2 miles downstream 3 days later. Clara was left with a 9-year-old daughter named Ruth and a 6-year-old son named George, a 40-acre parcel of rocky land on the valley's north slope, and a debt of $312 to the Bozeman Agricultural Credit Union that came due in full the following March. She had no family within 600 miles. She had no hired hand. She had a team of 2 horses, a milk cow, 14 chickens, and 11 cords of wood that she calculated would not last past February even if she burned carefully. Her social position in Cutter's Creek was what the era would have called precarious and what honest people would have called desperate. A widow with debt and children and no male relation was expected to make a specific set of choices. She was expected to sell the parcel. She was expected to take the children to relatives or to the Lutheran mission in Billings. She was expected to accept what was offered and be grateful. The settlement assumed, with quiet confidence, that by December Clara Hutchins would be someone else's problem. Harold Finch at the general store said she had lost her sense along with her husband. Reverend Aldous Crane of the First Lutheran Congregation called her situation untenable during a Sunday service she did not attend. Dorothea Pell, the wife of the largest landowner on the valley floor, said to 3 women at the quilting circle that it was a mercy Thomas had gone before he could see what his family would be reduced to. But Clara Hutchins knew something none of them knew. Her father had been a stonemason in Pennsylvania. She had grown up watching him work with his hands in a way that most people in Cutter's Creek had never seen. She remembered him packing stone into hillside walls that held the cold out better than any timber frame he ever built. She remembered him explaining, on a winter evening when she was 11 years old, that the earth itself held heat the way a cast iron pot held heat. That if you put yourself inside the earth rather than on top of it, the earth would do half your work for you. She had never forgotten that. She had spent 20 years in places where no one else seemed to know it. She decided in May, while the ground was still workable, that she was not selling the parcel. She was going into it. The mockery became official on a Tuesday morning in late September. Clara had come to McCreary's general store for a 50-pound sack of cornmeal and a coil of rope. She did not intend to stay long. She rarely did. Elias Vaughan was standing near the iron stove when she walked in. Elias Vaughan was not a man who was easy to dismiss. He had built 31 structures across 3 counties in 19 years. He had survived 14 Montana winters. He knew timber framing the way a surgeon knows bone. When he spoke about construction in Cutter's Creek, men wrote down what he said. He was 52 years old, and he had the hands of someone who had never once in his life done the wrong thing with an axe. He had heard what Clara Hutchins was planning. Word had reached him the way word reached everyone in a settlement of 200 souls. He looked at her when she set her cornmeal on the counter, and he did not soften what he said. He told her that a sod and stone dugout on a north-facing slope with a ceiling that low would fill with moisture by January and kill her children with lung sickness before the thaw. He told her the entrance angle she had described to the bellboy, who had apparently been talking, would funnel wind directly into the living space and drop her interior temperature by 15 degrees every time the door opened. He told her she would be back in a timber cabin or in the ground herself by February. He said it the way a man states arithmetic. No cruelty intended. Just the facts as he understood them. Clara looked at him for a moment. "I've read different," she said. She picked up her cornmeal and her rope and walked out. Standing beside Elias Vaughan that morning was a man named Garrett Sills. Garrett Sills was the regional loan agent for the Bozeman Agricultural Credit Union, the same institution that held Clara's $312 debt. He was 44, trim, with a wool coat that cost more than most families in the valley spent on food in a month. His cruelty, as Clara had already learned, was never personal. It was procedural. He informed her before she reached the door that the credit union had decided, given her circumstances, to move her debt repayment date forward to January 15th rather than March 1st. He said it was standard policy for accounts with elevated risk profiles. He said he was sorry for her loss. He did not look sorry. She did not respond to Garrett Sills at all. She walked to her wagon, and she drove home, and she picked up her tools, and she went back into the hillside. She had started digging in May, 2 weeks after the ground softened enough to work. The structure she was building was not a cabin, and it was not a cellar, and it was not anything that had a common name in Cutter's Creek. It was a dugout shelter cut 11 feet into the north-facing hillside, 14 feet wide and 9 feet tall at the center ridge, with walls packed from a combination of river sandstone, clay mortar mixed with straw, and the dense black earth of the hillside itself. The roof was 3 layers, raw timber salvaged from a collapsed barn on the Alderman property, then 6 inches of birch bark laid bark down for waterproofing, then 4 feet of compacted earth on top of that. The entrance tunnel ran 7 feet long and angled 22 degrees off the prevailing northwest wind so that no direct gust could push into the living space. The chimney rose only 4 feet above grade, short enough that the surrounding earth buffered the draw, long enough to pull smoke cleanly. She had figured this all out on paper through the summer. She had done the figuring by lamplight after Ruth and George were asleep, using the back pages of Thomas's account ledger and a charcoal pencil she sharpened with her paring knife. The digging alone took 6 weeks. She moved approximately 14 tons of earth with a pickaxe, a long-handled spade, and a wooden wheelbarrow that lost one of its handles in the 5th week and which she repaired with a length of hickory branch and a strip of harness leather. Her hands blistered through June, and by July the blisters had become calluses so thick she could press a hot coal and feel only pressure. A sandstone block she was fitting into the north wall shifted on August 3rd and crushed her left thumbnail black. She worked the next 11 days without being able to close that hand fully. She stopped mentioning it. Ruth, who was 9, carried water from the creek in a tin bucket every morning and handed stones up from the pile when her mother needed them. George, who was 6, packed clay mortar into the wall gaps using a flat piece of board, pressing it in with his palms the way Clara showed him. He was not strong enough to make it tight. She packed it again after he went to bed each night. She never told him that. By the end of the first week of October, the walls were finished and the roof timbers were in. By the 3rd week of October, the earth was packed on top and the entrance tunnel was complete. A neighbor named Silas Drummond rode past on a Wednesday afternoon and stopped his horse and stared at the low mound for a long moment. "That a root cellar you're putting in?" he called down. Clara was mortaring the tunnel entrance stones. She did not look up. "Something like that," she said. Silas Drummond nodded slowly and rode on. He told his wife that evening that the Hutchins widow was building a root cellar, which struck his wife as a reasonable thing to do, and the matter was dropped. Clara moved Ruth and George into the structure on October 29th. She hung 2 oil lanterns from the ceiling beams. She set up the small iron stove against the east wall with its pipe running up through a clay-sealed hole in the roof. She unpacked their bedding, their food stores, and Thomas's rifle. She looked at what she had built from the inside for the first time with everything in it. Ruth asked if they were going to live underground like moles. Clara thought about it. Like bears, she said. The first real test came on November 11, 1887. It was not the storm everyone would later remember. It was a smaller thing. A single hard night that dropped to 18 below zero by 2 in the morning and froze the water in the Drummond family's indoor holding barrel solid by dawn. The kind of night that in Cutter's Creek was considered ordinary and brutal and simply part of living where they lived. Clara had banked the small iron stove down to coals at 9 in the evening. She did this intentionally. She wanted to know what the earth alone would do. She lay awake in the dark and listened to Ruth and George breathing, and she watched the thermometer she had mounted to the east wall. At midnight, with the stove at near nothing and the outside temperature sitting at 23 below zero, the thermometer inside read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. She did not tell anyone this immediately. She wrote the number in Thomas's account ledger beside the date, and she put the ledger away, and she added 2 pieces of wood to the stove, and she went to sleep. A man named Wendell Cross saw the result indirectly. Wendell Cross was the Cutter's Creek postmaster, 58 years old, neither a friend nor an enemy of Clara Hutchins, a man who prided himself on having no strong opinions about anything he had not personally verified. He came to the structure 3 days after that cold night to deliver a letter from Clara's cousin in Butte. He had never seen the finished structure up close. He crouched through the entrance tunnel and stood up inside and went very still. He had expected cold. He had expected the particular damp misery of an unheated hole in the ground. Instead, he felt what he later described to his wife as a stubborn warmth. Not comfortable exactly. Not warm the way a well-stoked parlor is warm. But alive. Like the cold had been told it was not welcome here and had, grudgingly, stayed outside. He pressed his palm flat against the south wall without thinking about it. The stone was not cold. It was the temperature of a hand that had been resting quietly in a lap. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at Clara. He did not say anything for a moment. He said finally. Clara handed him a cup of coffee and did not explain anything. He drank it and delivered the letter and left. He told no one what he had felt for almost 2 weeks. It did not seem like his information to share. Winter had barely started. The real test was still coming. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. The real storm announced itself on the morning of December 1st, 1887, in the way that the worst storms always announce themselves on the northern frontier. Not with drama, with absence. The birds stopped. The wind, which had been blowing steadily out of the northwest for 6 days, went completely silent before dawn. The temperature, which had been sitting at 4 below zero, dropped to 11 below between 6 in the morning and 9 in the morning. 3 degrees every hour. Clara felt the change before she had fully woken up. She lay still for a moment and listened to the quality of the silence outside, and then she rose and added wood to the stove and checked the food stores and looked at her children sleeping and said nothing. By noon on December 1st, the wind had returned, and it was no longer the wind that anyone in Cutter's Creek recognized. It came from the northwest at what witnesses would later estimate at 40 miles per hour, with gusts that shook timber frame walls and drove snow horizontally across the valley floor in sheets so dense that the Drummond homestead, which was only 300 yards from the McCreary store, became completely invisible from the road. The temperature at noon was 19 below zero. By 4 in the afternoon it was 27 below. By 8 that evening it had reached 31 below zero and was still dropping. Elias Vaughan, the man who had built 31 structures in 19 years and who had said Clara would be back in a timber cabin by February, was burning through wood at a rate he had not burned through wood in a decade. His cabin was well built. His fireplace was large and efficient by the standards of 1887. He burned 8 logs on the night of December 1st just to hold his interior temperature at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. He burned 8 more through the early hours of December 2nd. By dawn he had burned through 19 logs in a single night, and his interior temperature had not climbed above 44 degrees at any point. The Drummond family, Silas and his wife and their 3 children, burned 22 logs between sundown on December 1st and sunrise on December 2nd. Their interior temperature at 3 in the morning was 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Silas Drummond later said it was the first time in 11 winters that he had genuinely considered whether his family was in danger. Garrett Sills, the loan agent from the Bozeman Agricultural Credit Union, closed the shutters on his office windows and did not leave the building for 31 hours. Inside Clara Hutchins' structure in the hillside at the northern edge of the valley, the thermometer on the east wall read 52 degrees Fahrenheit at midnight on December 1st. The stove was burning, but not working hard. Clara burned a total of 6 logs across the entire night. Not 6 logs per hour. Not 6 logs before midnight. 6 logs total from sundown to sunrise. Ruth slept through the whole storm without waking once. George kicked his blanket off at some point in the night because he was too warm. The outside temperature at its lowest point, recorded at 4:17 in the morning of December 2nd, was 34 below zero. The inside temperature at that same hour was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. A difference of 88 degrees between what the storm was doing and what the earth was holding. Clara wrote both numbers in Thomas's account ledger and underlined them once. She did not celebrate. She put another log on the stove and went back to her blanket and listened to the wind working itself against the hillside above her head, looking for a way in, finding none. The storm did not break on December 2nd. It gathered itself instead. The wind dropped briefly in the early afternoon, enough that 3 families in the settlement believed it was over and let their fires burn lower than they should have. By 6 in the evening it came back harder than before. A second push from the northwest, colder and drier than the first, driving the temperature down past what the settlement's oldest residents said they had ever recorded in 40 years of Montana winters. That was when the second crisis arrived inside the hillside. George had been coughing since mid-morning. Clara had noticed it and told herself it was the dry air from the stove. By early afternoon the cough had moved deeper into his chest, and his forehead was hot against her palm, and his eyes had taken on the particular glassy quality that every frontier mother recognized and feared. By 4 in the afternoon he had a fever of what she estimated at 103 degrees, and he was shivering despite 2 blankets and the stove burning steadily. She had no doctor within 9 miles. The road was impassable. The temperature outside at that hour was 29 below zero, and the wind was moving at what she judged to be 35 miles per hour or better. She had willow bark in her stores, and she boiled it into a tea and got most of it into George, and she packed him with every spare piece of clothing she owned, and she sat beside him, and she thought with absolute clarity about what she could and could not do. What she could not do was get him to a doctor. What she could do was trust the structure. She made a decision that she had not planned to make, and that frightened her more than anything that had happened since April 14th when Thomas went into the Yellowstone River. She let the stove go out completely. Not banked. Not low. Out. She wanted to know, with George sick and her 9-year-old daughter watching her with large silent eyes, exactly what the earth would hold without any help at all. She sat in the dark with a candle, and she watched the thermometer, and she counted. At the first hour the temperature inside read 49 degrees Fahrenheit. At the second hour it read 47 degrees. At the third hour it read 46 degrees. Then it stopped falling. The thermometer held at 46 degrees for the next 2 hours without moving, while outside the temperature dropped to 34 below zero, and the wind drove snow against the hillside with a sound like a river running overhead. 46 degrees. No fire. No stove. No fuel burning anywhere in the structure. Just the earth doing what her father had told her the earth would do when she was 11 years old. Ruth had been watching the thermometer too. She looked at her mother across the candlelight. "Are we going to be all right?" she asked. Clara looked at her daughter for a long moment. She looked at George, sweating now under his blankets, which was what she had been waiting for. "The earth is warm," Clara said. "It always has been." She relit the stove. George's fever broke before midnight. By dawn he was asking for cornbread. She did not have cornbread, but she had dried apple, and he ate it sitting up in his blankets and complained that it was not what he wanted, which she took as a reliable indicator that he was going to be fine. She wrote 2 more numbers in Thomas's ledger. Outside, 34 below. Inside, without fire, 46 degrees. She underlined them the same way she had underlined the others. Once. Then she closed the ledger and put it away. The storm broke on the morning of December 3rd. It did not apologize for what it had done. It simply stopped, the way violence sometimes stops, leaving behind a silence that felt wrong after so much noise. The sky came up blue and brutal and clear, and the temperature outside at sunrise was 22 below zero, which after the previous 36 hours felt, to the people of Cutter's Creek, almost mild. Wendell Cross, the postmaster who had pressed his palm against Clara's wall and said only HM and told no one what he had felt, put on every piece of clothing he owned and walked the half-mile from the settlement to the north slope of the valley. He had not slept well. He had spent the worst hours of the storm thinking about the thermometer reading he had seen 3 weeks earlier and wondering with increasing unease whether he should have told someone about it sooner. He came over the last rise expecting, at some level he had not admitted to himself, to find the structure collapsed under the weight of snow or the entrance tunnel drifted over or some other confirmation of what Elias Vaughan had predicted. He stopped walking when he saw her. Clara Hutchins was outside the structure in the blue morning cold, hanging wet laundry on a rope she had strung between 2 cottonwood stumps. Her breath came out in clouds. Her movements were steady and unhurried. She had a wooden clothespin in her mouth, and she was smoothing one of George's shirts along the line with her bare red hands, as though the temperature were an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. Wendell Cross stood in the snow and looked at this for a long moment, and then he walked the rest of the way down the slope and crouched through the entrance tunnel and stood up inside. He removed his coat without thinking about it. He became aware that he had done this only when he felt the coat hanging from his hand and looked down at it with mild surprise, the way a man looks at an object he does not remember picking up. He found the thermometer on the east wall. Outside, the temperature was 22 below zero. The thermometer inside read 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He stood there with his coat in his hand. "That is warmer than my home," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "With the stove burning all night." Elias Vaughan came 2 days later. He came alone, which Clara noted but did not comment on. He spent 47 minutes inside the structure, which she also noted. He examined the wall construction at the north face. He looked at the roof junction where the birch bark met the earth pack. He crouched in the entrance tunnel and studied the angle of it for a long time. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the stove, which was running at barely a quarter of its capacity. He looked at Clara's log pile, which after the entire storm showed a reduction of 13 logs total compared to the 40-plus logs that every timber cabin in the valley had burned through in the same period. He put his hat back on. He looked at her directly. "I was wrong," he said. Clara nodded once. She picked up her mending and returned to it. That was the whole of it. No elaboration was offered and none was requested, and the matter, between the two of them, was settled. The knowledge did not spread the way news spreads. It did not spread through announcement or meeting or the Lutheran Church bulletin. It spread the way useful things have always spread on the frontier, one person at a time, through direct need and direct observation and the particular humility that arrives when a hard winter has made a person honest about what they do not know. Silas Drummond came first. He came on December 9th with his hat in his hands and asked if he could look at what she had built. Clara showed him everything. She showed him the wall composition and the roof layering and the entrance angle and the reason for the chimney height. She showed him the numbers in Thomas's ledger. She answered every question he asked without shortening her answers or making him feel that he should already know what she was telling him. He left with 4 pages of notes written on the back of a feed receipt. He began digging his own structure into the south-facing hillside behind his barn in the spring of 1888. Elias Vaughan came back a second time in January with a proper notebook. He asked better questions than Silas Drummond had asked because he knew more about construction and therefore knew more precisely what he did not understand. Clara answered those questions too. He sat at her small table and drew diagrams and asked her to correct them when they were wrong, which she did without comment. He built his first earth-sheltered structure for the Alderman family in the fall of 1888. He built 3 more the following year. He told people, when they asked where the idea had come from, that a woman on the north slope of Cutter's Creek Valley had figured it out from memory and necessity, and that they should have seen what her walls looked like from the inside. Garrett Sills, the loan agent from the Bozeman Agricultural Credit Union, received Clara's debt repayment of $312 in full on January 14, 1888, one day before his revised deadline. She had sold 2 acres of the rocky eastern portion of her parcel to Wendell Cross, who wanted to expand his kitchen garden and had offered her a fair price without being asked. Garrett Sills processed the repayment, stamped the account closed, and was not heard from again in this story because results had made him irrelevant, which is the quietest and most complete form of defeat available to institutional men. By the winter of 1889, families in the Shields Valley 40 miles to the northeast were building earth-sheltered structures using methods that had traveled to them through a chain of 4 people that traced back to Clara's ledger. By 1891, a homesteading guide published in Billings described the technique in a single paragraph without naming its source, which was the way most useful knowledge traveled in that era. By 1893, a variation of the method had reached homesteaders in the Dakota Territory, where the winters were different enough that adaptations had to be made, but the core principle held. The core principle was the one Clara's father had explained to her by lamplight in Pennsylvania when she was 11 years old. That the Earth holds heat at a steady 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of what the air above it is doing. That if you place yourself inside the Earth rather than on top of it, you are borrowing warmth that has been stored there since before anyone can remember. That the ground does not care what the sky is doing. It holds its temperature the way old things hold their nature. Quietly and without effort and without end. Clara Hutchins lived in the structure on the north slope of the Cutter's Creek Valley for 11 more years. She expanded it twice. In 1891, she added a second room, 12 feet by 10 feet, with its own small stove and a second entrance on the east side for the animals in the worst cold. In 1894, she deepened the main room by 3 feet, which dropped her floor temperature by 2 degrees in summer and raised her winter floor temperature by 4 degrees, a trade she considered entirely favorable. Ruth married a surveyor from Livingston in 1896 and moved east. George stayed on the parcel and worked it until 1921 and was known in that part of the valley as a man who understood soil and cold in ways that other men found difficult to explain, but easy to benefit from. Clara herself never spoke publicly about what she had built or why it worked or what it had cost her to build it. She did not attend the meeting in 1892 at which Elias Vaughan presented earth-sheltered construction methods to a gathering of 40 homesteaders in the Gallatin Valley. She had not been invited, which was the kind of thing that happened in 1892, and she did not go uninvited, which was the kind of thing Clara Hutchins never did. The structure still stands today. The entrance tunnel is partially collapsed and the stove is long gone, but the north wall, the one she packed herself from sandstone and river clay and the dense black earth of the hillside, is intact. If you press your palm flat against it on a cold day, which some people still do, it is not cold. It is the temperature of a hand that has been resting quietly in a lap. It has been that temperature for 138 years. What Clara Hutchins understood, and what most people in Cutter's Creek spent years failing to understand, was not complicated once you saw it clearly. She did not fight the winter. She did not try to overpower 34 below zero with fire and timber and sheer determination. She put herself inside something older and warmer and more patient than any storm that had ever come down from the Canadian Rockies, and she let it do what it had always done. Sometimes the difference between surviving and freezing is not strength or pride. It is the willingness to trust what the earth has always known, even when every expert in the room is telling you that you are wrong. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes quiet strength still matters.